Hey, I'm Hollie. I'm a dietitian and nutritionist, and I also personally have celiac disease. So I'm here this week to talk to you guys a little bit about some of the nutrients I would look for in a gluten-free diet, particularly after diagnosis of celiac disease. So if you're here this week going through all these talks, I'm sure you're already familiar that celiac disease is an autoimmune condition, and this is triggered by the consumption of gluten, which is an umbrella term for proteins that are found in wheat, barley, rye, and oats. This response causes inflammation in the intestine. This is the key area of our digestive tract that we use to absorb nutrients. So there's these little villi, they're kind of finger-like projections through our digestive tract. These become inflamed, flattened, and damaged when gluten is consumed, and there's that prolonged response. So the cells on the villi break down and absorb nutrients from food. So when we do consume gluten and we are having this response, this in turn impacts our ability to absorb nutrients. So deficiency of nutrients, including iron, calcium, and folate, are all pretty common at diagnosis, unfortunately. And the longer celiac disease remains untreated and or undiagnosed, nutrients such as B12, zinc, fat, and fat-soluble vitamins, so they're your vitamins A, D, E, and K, can also be impacted. So this kind of ongoing malabsorption can lead to really a multitude of health issues, including anemia, osteoporosis. At diagnosis, most adults have quite poor, adults and children have reduced bone density, also fertility problems, and also some cancers, unfortunately. One positive though is that if you adhere to a strict gluten-free diet, the damage to this small intestine does begin to heal and recover, and with this, so does your ability to absorb nutrients. This is particularly seen when you diagnose earlier in life rather than later at life. You tend to recover and heal quite well as a child, and then if you're adhering to a strict gluten-free diet from then, there's far less risk. Of course, when you're diagnosed, you would look to improve your nutrition status and to help with this recovery that we need and prevent any persisting nutrition deficiencies. But it can still be a little tricky when you're following a gluten-free diet. So there are still some nutrients that deserve our focus. Once we've been diagnosed, once we feel like we've recovered, we're over a year out, everything's going quite well. So I thought that's what we would look at today. So the first thing that I would say to look out for is iron. And this is one that I look for with all of my celiac clients, all of my clients anyways, but particularly with celiac disease. As I mentioned earlier, many with celiac disease are starting out with low iron. And this is a mineral that actually 1 in 8 Australians over the age of 2 actually struggle to meet their requirements for, particularly among females. So we're not alone, but it's definitely something I would look for here. And a reason is that it can still be a little more difficult to reach our iron requirements on a gluten-free diet. So gluten-containing breads and cereals that have been iron fortified are few and far between to find when you're on a gluten-free diet. So typically Australians get about a third of their daily iron intake from these breads and cereal options. So when we've taken a lot of those away, it becomes far more difficult. Obviously, it's a big group that we're relying on. So I guess first to cover what iron actually is, why we need it. Iron's essential for the production of red blood cells, transporting oxygen around your blood, producing energy, and for optimal immune function. So it's kind of important. And some gluten-free iron sources still do include, your animal proteins, lentils and legumes, eggs, dark leafy greens, nuts and seeds. Seeds like pepitas in particular are really great and gluten-free. Unfortunately, unlike our gluten-containing cereals, as I said, it's very, very difficult to get those iron-fortified packaged bread and cereal options. So one brand that I would mention that is iron fortified is the Genius brand. I've only seen them at Coles, but they do add iron to their bread loaves, not their rolls and wraps from my experience, but they can be a good option to help add that in. Yeah, so then the next lot that we would look out for is more of a group. So your folate and also your other B vitamins. So B vitamins are essential for many functions, including energy production and the production of red blood cells. Folate in particular is important for the development of the fetal nervous system, as well as DNA synthesis and cell growth. So that's why you hear so much about it being essential during pregnancy and also for women who are of childbearing age and could fall pregnant. So as a public health initiative, the addition of folic acid and also thiamine, another vitamin known as B1, became mandatory to be added to wheat flours for bread making purposes, and this is to aid in reducing that risk of any neural tube defects and also this potentially fatal neurological disorder caused by thiamine deficiency. So we now get over 30% of these nutrients from our breads and cereals with these added. Difficult thing is, unfortunately, that this requirement doesn't extend to gluten-free breads. So there is a greater risk of inadequacy in gluten-free diets. Generally, we do get our B vitamins from a wide variety of foods. So I do encourage having a varied diet within your gluten-free constraints, of course, but I do think it's something worth being mindful of. The same also goes for any of your organic breads, breads that aren't unleavened or don't have yeasts in them. So some sources of gluten-free folate include your gluten-free whole grains, so things like quinoa and buckwheat, dark leafy greens, legumes, seeds, poultry, and eggs. Some gluten-free sources of thiamine include your legumes, nuts and seeds, yeast, and also pork. So there's some things to keep in mind and look out for in your diet. There are brands like Helga's and Country Life. They add thiamine to their breads. The Genius brand again add thiamine and folic acid and other B vitamins to their gluten-free bread, so they're also quite a good option. I would say that a lot of the cereals like your Sanitarium and Kellogg's that are gluten-free, they do add the B vitamins. Not all of them are adding I guess all the B vitamins, or going back to the iron before, not all of them are adding iron when they do quite often in their non-gluten-free options. So it's worth having a look for. They're always listed on the nutrition label in the ingredient list. So the next one for consideration is calcium. As I mentioned, reduced bone density is common in those newly diagnosed with celiac disease, and this can improve over that first year following a strict gluten-free diet. However, it's important to make sure we're optimizing our diet and ensuring you're meeting your requirements of calcium, and side note, also vitamin D. For our bone health. So less than half of Australians are actually meeting their calcium requirements, whether they're celiac or not, and that's why it's particularly important to be mindful of if you are going into this process with already poor bone health, I suppose. So the other thing I always like to consider as well is due to the damage caused to the villi in the small intestine, it's quite common to develop secondary lactose intolerance, which can further confuse our attempts to meet our calcium requirements. This is separate to those who have lactose intolerance and typically temporary, so as you heal that improves. But I have found for a lot of people that limits, I guess, the sources of calcium we would typically go to. But just to cover, I guess, why we need calcium, because I do think we only think about it when it comes to our bones, is that it's not only needed for that, but also muscle, cardiac, neurological function, cell signaling, hormone regulation. And if we don't actually consume enough calcium through our diet, then we dip into our stored calcium. So that's where bones come into play, and that's to keep everything else working. So that's why if we don't get enough through our diet, our risk of osteoporosis increases. So just to put into perspective, the recommended intake of calcium for adults, so women up to the age of 50 and men up to the age of 70, is 1,000 milligrams a day. About a standard glass of cow's milk would give you about 300 milligrams of calcium. So it's a decent amount that we actually need to consistently consume through the day. So one good thing is many of our calcium sources are naturally gluten-free. So that's our cow's milk products, whether that's lactose-free or not. Dark leafy greens like kale, soy products like tofu, salmon, nuts and seeds like almonds and chia seeds have some too. There are also your calcium fortified plant milk, so your almond milk, your soy milk, oat milk, all of the nut milks that exist now. I would just say if you are looking for those plant milk options, please make sure you're checking whether they've added calcium in. So what we would want to look for is on the nutrition label, look at the 100 mils, not the per serve, the 100 mils, and check that there's at least 120 milligrams per 100 mil to match that of cow's milk content. That will make it a lot easier to get your needs met. And then the last one, but definitely not least, is fiber. So fiber is actually the edible part of plants that is resistant to digestion by us. So it travels all the way down our digestive tract to our large bowel, where it's either partially or completely fermented by the gut bugs that live there. It isn't just important for keeping us regular though. So it's also important for reducing our risk of and managing chronic conditions like type 2 diabetes, heart disease, and colon cancer. That one in particular, thank you to our gut bugs. It's one that's really important to look out for. And unfortunately, when we follow a gluten-free diet, our intake of fiber will often reduce. So I guess if you were to have a look at, your gluten-free breads and biscuits and things like that, quite often at the very beginning of that nutrition label or the ingredient list, you would see that your breads and cereals are made from quite refined starches. So these are much lower fiber options. They're not as similar to your whole grain gluten containing options that you would normally get. So to keep your fiber intake up on a gluten-free diet, I would opt for whole grain bread varieties, use flours like buckwheat and sorghum, try things like pulse pastas, they're quite high in fiber, include grains like brown rice rather than a white rice, go for some quinoa. When you're snacking through the day, look to include some fruits, some veggie sticks, popcorn. Don't forget about nuts and seeds. They're great to sprinkle on anything and everything. And also lentils and legumes. Those things are all naturally gluten-free, so they're really wonderful to include in our diet. And when shopping, check your nutrition label options and make sure that there's at least 3 grams of fiber per serve for your bread and cereal options or similar. That will help guide you towards some higher fiber choices. So that's it for me. They're the main nutrients I would say to look out for. I hope this was useful. I know monitoring your diet when you're following a gluten-free diet, particularly a strict one, it can feel intimidating as it is. So take it little by little. Maybe this week look at the iron in your common meals and snacks, and then next week start checking the fiber content of your common options while you're doing the grocery shop. Each little bit over time will help you get a more rounded diet when your options are a little limited. But if you need any further help, feel free to reach out, and best of luck. Thanks. Bye.